Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Bullpen Theater. Welcome to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Very excited to kick off our 2015 author series throughout the course of the summer. We're going to be hearing from 11 different authors covering a variety of topics. We have authors that will be talking about Babe Ruth and his called shot. We have an author, Bill Pennington, who will be here later in the summer to talk about the very controversial and fiery Billy Martin. Today we're going to kick things off with a topic I'm really looking forward to hear about. The book is called Tony Oliva, The Life and Times of a Minnesota Twins Legend. I had the pleasure of meeting Tony Oliva probably about 15 years ago. He just showed up in town for an induction weekend. And on Sunday of induction weekend, we always have a meeting at the funeral parlor in town, believe it or not, for the Society for American Baseball Research. It's always on Sunday night. And one of the people from the Society, from SABR, asked Tony Oliva, would you make an appearance at the meeting? And Tony's such a good guy, he said, sure. Spur of the moment, he came over and talked to us, said hi, shook hands, and really kind of livened up our meeting that weekend. So I had a very good first impression of Tony Oliva. And then last year, I went to the All-Star game in Minnesota for the Hall of Fame to work there, and I was just amazed the way that Tony Oliva is revered. He is considered almost a godlike figure in the Twin Cities. It is just amazing. So I was very excited to see that we have this definitive biography of Tony Oliva coming out. And we're very glad to have with us today the author of that biography. His name is Thom Henninger. This is Tom's first book, but he has told me that he's already started writing a second book. He has written for Baseball America, he has written for ESPN, and he is currently an editor and writer at Baseball Digest. So we're very glad to have with us to kick off our 2015 author series, Thom Henninger, to talk about Tony Oliva, The Life and Times of a Minnesota Twins Legend. Tom, welcome to Cooperstown.
Well,
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Good to see you all here. I hope you're having a wonderful time in the area. It's certainly a beautiful area, nice place to drive as well. I had a nice drive from Syracuse yesterday. So, well, let's get started. While I was writing this book, a new generation of Cuban players have arrived on the major league scene. It's been a remarkable story. And for me, it's reminiscent of the 1950s and early 60s, a time when a gentleman named Papa Joe Cambria, a scout, brought talent into the United States from Cuba. He was the only scout working the island, and he worked exclusively for the Washington Senators and then the Minnesota Twins when the franchise moved in 1961. Now, what that generation and the current generation of Cubans share is an isolation from family, friends, and their homeland as a result of U.S.-Cuban relations, which have been problematic going back to the 60s. Today's generation has had to make that hard decision whether to leave their homeland because they know that once they leave, it'll be difficult to come back. In fact, at this point, the Cuban government has dictated that anyone who leaves cannot return for at least 8 years, and of course that's a big decision with family and friends involved. Now 50, 60 years ago, the Cubans faced this same dilemma, but the dynamic was quite a bit different. In the 1950s, the players could come and go between Cuba and the United States. They would play either Major League Baseball or minor league baseball here for the 6-7 months, then return home and play winter ball in Cuba. And at that time, the Cuban Winter League was one of the exclusive top-notch leagues in Latin America. In fact, so much so that many of the Cubans said they made more money playing 3 months of winter ball than they played in 6 or 7 months playing in the United States. So that was the scenario when suddenly the Cuban Revolution took place at the end of the 1950s, and then in 1961, soon after the U.S. suspended diplomatic relations with Cuba, players had to make a decision as important as any in their life. That February in '61, at the conclusion of the Winter League, there were a group of Cubans ready to go to spring training, but they were playing a pickup softball game at a training site in Havana when suddenly out of the blue, Fidel Castro appeared. And the first thing he did tell them is that the Cuban League would be suspended. It would end after the following season. But more importantly, he told them they would have a choice to make. like I say, they were ready to go back to the United States for spring training. He told them they could go ahead and leave. If they left, they better make their home in the United States. They wouldn't be coming back. And then he said, if you chose to stay, you weren't going to be leaving again. So, as it turns out, of course, all the major leaguers did return and did not go home. And then their fate was sealed 2 months later in April 1961 when the failed Bay of Pigs invasion took place. And this, of course, was the CIA orchestrated an invasion using Cuban emigres who lived in the United States. But the plan did dramatically underestimate the popularity of the revolution at that time, and it was soundly defeated in just a matter of days. Well, at this time, when this invasion was taking place, a young man named Pedro Oliva was on his way to the United States for a tryout with the Minnesota Twins, a franchise that just moved from Washington that spring. Pedro did not have a birth certificate, so when it came to get a passport, he used his brother Tony's birth certificate, and he's been Tony ever since. And he has told me, actually, once he got used to hearing Tony, he kind of liked it, so he took on his new name with pride. So, he came over here with 21 other Cuban prospects. They were headed to Florida. They were going to get a tryout, spend the last 2 weeks of spring training in the minor league camp. And unfortunately, with what was going on politically, they had to go to Mexico City to get visas, and they ended up spending 11 days in Mexico. And by the time they landed in Florida, they only had 3 days to impress. Well, Tony says that in 3 exhibition games, the final 3 of the year, he went 7 for 10. But he'd had so little coaching in Cuba, and he was so raw defensively, that the Twins decided not to resign him. So here he was in a position, suddenly, he didn't have a contract, he had nowhere to go. He was waiting for his return visa to go home, and because of issues going on, the process was going very slow. And by virtue of that, Tony got a second chance. And it's something that now he looks back, he calls it a miracle. But in that time, it was nothing but. It was something that he thought much more of as a nightmare. He had come from a very remote part of Cuba, had never been away from home, had never been as far as Havana even. And suddenly here he was lonely for home, disappointed that he hadn't been signed. And then on top of that, he didn't have a contract, he didn't have a working knowledge of English. And this is what he faced when he had been turned down. At that point, he shared his feelings about going home with another veteran minor leaguer from Cuba, a man named Minnie Mendoza. And this is someone who had befriended Cubans who had come from the island. He'd become a bit of a surrogate father to many of the Cubans. And at that point, Minnie Mendoza had another idea. I'm going to read 3 excerpts from the book. The first one I think is important because it really encapsulates what Tony experienced in his first few weeks in the United States. When Oliva told Mendoza he wanted to return to Pinar del Rio, the veteran ball player had another idea. Mendoza encouraged Oliva to see Phil Hauser, the general manager of the Hornets, the minor league team in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a nearly lifelong employee of the Griffith family. Hauser and Calvin Griffith, the Twins' owner, had been close friends since the late 1930s, when Hauser was beginning his 32-year tenure with the Hornets, and Griffith at that time was the team's manager. Now, Hauser had helped Mendoza and many other Cubans settle into North American life, frequently offering young players meal money and a place to stay in Charlotte. He was known to look out for young arrivals who had some talent but were extremely raw and not ready to take on a minor league assignment. Papa Joe Cambria did not want to see his talented find go home, so he encouraged the general manager to do the same with Oliva. As it turned out, Hauser was intrigued by Oliva's potential. Mendoza says Hauser expressed an interest in bringing Oliva to Charlotte, where the young man could work with the Hornets club and wait for a team to sign him. In the meantime, even though Oliva was not ready to play on his roster, Hauser would pay for his housing and meals. Mendoza recalls that Oliva initially said no to going to Charlotte, but he finally convinced him to give it a shot. For Oliva, Hauser's hunch and generosity delayed a one-way ticket to Pinar del Rio. Going to Charlotte provided Oliva an opportunity to work on his game with a professional team, and at the same time get acclimated to his new culture. Oliva met Hauser the April morning he arrived in Charlotte, with Mendoza serving as his interpreter. Hauser offered to pay for Oliva's housing and $3 a day in meal money, the going rate in the South Atlantic League. Both Mendoza and Nestor Velasquez, another Cuban, played for Charlotte that summer. They were roommates and often hosted Oliva for meals when the Hornets were at home. Mendoza had a car and the trio drove to the ballpark together. But Oliva was not officially on the roster, so he was not allowed to play in games or accompany the teams on road trips. Consequently, Oliva spent a lot of time alone. When the Hornets traveled, he walked the 5 miles to and from the ballpark to work out by himself. A taxi ride cost roughly $1 each way, an expense that would quickly eat up his meal money, so he made the daily trek on foot. Because Oliva spoke virtually no English, everyday life was an obstacle course, a form of isolation that seemed to grow. He was unable to ask directions, to read menus in restaurants, or to engage in conversation when he was most lonely. So that he could survive the Hornets' first road trip, Hauser gave him 2 pieces of paper, one with ham and eggs written on it, and another marked fried chicken. For days on end, that was all Oliva ate. In time, Oliva found that he could go home, but he faced the same dilemma that the major leaguers faced. If he were to go home, he wasn't coming back, and that would nullify any opportunity to play in the major leagues, so he definitely stayed. A key difference at this point in time, which illustrates his loneliness, is that the other Cubans had all been veterans. Tony came over during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Most of the other guys had lived in the U.S. for a lengthy stretch of time. They'd learned the language, they'd become adjusted. Most of them had been married and had children by that point, but these were struggles that Tony faced alone. Tony did sign a contract that summer and hit .410 in a rookie ball that year, a sign of what was to come, and he quickly climbed through the minor leagues. Living conditions and travel arrangements did improve, of course, the higher you climb, but there was one exception for Tony, and that was upon reaching AAA Dallas-Fort Worth in 1963. There were 2 unanticipated occupational hazards playing for the AAA club, one more threatening than the other. The team owned its own plane, a Douglas DC-3, which had been in vogue in the 1940s. This particular plane had seen better days by the time Oliva, Cesar Tovar, Sandy Valdespino, and their Dallas-Fort Worth teammates were flying between AAA destinations in the mid-1960s. Smooth flights were rare, and a few trips were downright alarming. Oliva recalls 2 or 3 hair-raising flights that summer, including one between Dallas and Seattle that had players wondering if they might be living out their final minutes. One of the plane's engines developed a problem, and as the decrepit DC-3 sputtered, the pilots warned their passengers that an emergency landing was a distinct possibility. The crew managed to land the plane without incident, but the white-knuckle affair had the young men contemplating their mortality with every turbulent hiccup and dip in altitude. Even when both engines were working properly, Valdespino says the players called the plane the knuckleball for the way it danced and darted in the air. Even getting back on solid ground could generate anxiety. One touchdown in particular took the phrase hard landing to new heights. I remember a time we were flying to Oklahoma City, Oliva says. We hit the runway so hard that the plane took off again. We had to go around and get in line to land again. I remember when we had to go to Denver, says Lee Stang, who mostly pitched for the Twins that summer but made 8 starts for the Rangers. We couldn't get over the mountains, so we used to go in between them. That Denver flight was the scariest one to me. I'd sit up front behind the pilots, and you could see the mountains coming at you. Well, a year later, Tony had escaped those nasty flights, and he won Rookie of the Year honors in 1964. Of course, he was also the first American League rookie to ever win a batting title. He also led the league in runs, hits, doubles, and total bases. Despite all that, there's something that happened off the field in 1964 that probably impacted his life at least as much as anything that happened on the field. He was a single man, and as a single man, he rented a room in the Hotel Maryland in downtown Minneapolis. And that spring of his rookie year, he met a group of high school students from Hitchcock, South Dakota, of all places, who were staying there as part of their senior class trip. The graduating class of 26 included twins Gordon and Gordette Dubois, and they met Oliva very early in their stay in the hotel lobby. Tony came in, and Tony being Tony, even though he could only say 10 words of English, he still had that charisma, recalls Gordette, who has been married for more than 40 years to the man she met in the lobby that day. He came right up to all of us kids and signed our pieces of ripped up paper that we gave him to sign. There were about 5 or 6 of us in the group, and he stayed and tried to talk to all of us. Oliva gave the group a tour of downtown Minneapolis in his new car, which had been loaned to him by a local car dealer. It was part of a memorable weekend for Gradette and her brother, and it included a final meeting with Oliva before they returned to Hitchcock on that Sunday. When we were going to split, he asked me for my telephone number, Gordette says. I looked at my brother and I said, I'm not sure, but I think he's asking me for my telephone number. And Gordon said, what's the difference? He's probably not going to call you anyway. Well, Tony did call, and they began a relationship by phone, and it was a very awkward and difficult one in which only a few words of English or Spanish were understood by the other. But they did eventually connect. She took a job in Minneapolis, and by 1968 they did marry. And by that time, of course, Tony was a star with the Twins. And the Twins clubhouse was something when he came there in '64 really made him feel at home. It really helped him out. As there were always a number of Cubans on the roster. These were people, of course, with whom he shared many experiences of adjusting and getting to know the world of baseball in the United States. I also do cover the stories of these Cubans as well in the book, and I think at this time it'd be fun to look at some slides. We'll see slides of the players and also a few of the career highlights of Tony's. Thanks, Bruce. Well, this is Minnie Mendoza. Minnie actually didn't arrive with the Twins until 1970 as a 36-year-old rookie, and he had a very short stay. Mostly was a career minor leaguer, but I did want to highlight him here because of the important role he played in Tony's life. It's very likely without Minnie, Tony would have went home, and none of us would have heard of him, and I wouldn't be sitting here. So, interestingly for Minnie, he came in 1954, signed with the Reds, was cut loose in 58. At that time, the Reds had a AAA affiliate in Havana, so they did sign a few players, including Hall of Famer Tony Perez. But during his time in Washington, by the time Oliva arrived in '61, he'd been cooking for large groups of Cubans. He'd have them into his home. He was renting a home. There were as many as 30 or 40 Cubans in camp every year with the Twins, and it wasn't unusual for Minnie to be cooking meals and letting them hang out, and they could sit around and talk about baseball or about the adjustments they were making or the difficulties in their life. And Minnie says that the landlord probably wouldn't have been happy with these gatherings he held, but he did provide a haven for the Cuban contingent in camp. When Cuba closed through the Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, his wife Julia was in Cuba, pregnant with the second of their two daughters, and it did take them nearly 4 years to reunite. And by the time Minnie saw his youngest daughter, for the first time, she was nearly 3 years old. This is Julio Becker. He's the, as it says, he's the elder statesman of the contingent. He arrived in 1951. By the mid-50s, he had become one of the better pinch hitters in the American League for Washington. Julio speaks highly of Washington. He loved living there. Thought it was a very welcoming place for people of color. And one of his joys in life was going to the Key Club, which was a jazz venue not far from DC Stadium where the Senators played. And during that era, he said he saw most of the premier jazz talents of the era, including Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and Ella Fitzgerald. Julio had been in the United States for nearly a decade by the time Cuba closed in 1961, but he was newly married. His wife Edith was still in Cuba, hadn't come over for the beginning of spring training or for the beginning of the new season, and consequently they also had to deal with the bureaucratic maze of getting Edith here. Calvin Griffith stepped forward. He still had lots of Washington connections, worked the Washington end. Papa Joe Cambria, the scout in Cuba, helped Edith through the maze of paperwork to get her visa in order, and they were reunited within a year and then settled in Minnesota. Julio's last year in the majors was '61. He was older than the rest of the gentlemen, and Tony never did play with him. But Tony was brought up to Minnesota that September 1961. He wasn't on the roster, but they wanted him to get acclimated to the major league scene, get used to the Twin Cities, which was clearly the biggest metropolitan area he'd ever been into that point. And Julio quickly became his mentor. Tony lived with him a brief time that September, and soon they became close friends. And it turns out Julio stayed, and looking back now, Julio and Tony are the only two Cubans from that era who have endured Minnesota winters all these years and still live in Minnesota. And that's no easy task. So, as a Minnesotan, I can attest to that. Well, this is Camilo Pascual on the right with his longtime battery mate, Earl Batty, who was a Spanish speaker and was a big help to many of the players. Camilo arrived in 1951 as well, the same year as Julio, but he was just 17 at the time, and he came over here as an infielder. But Papa Joe Cambria convinced him his future was in pitching, quickly changed positions, and it wasn't long before he was making his mark in the game. He joined the talent-thin Senators in 1954. The team was desperate for help. He clearly was not ready. He says he endured a lot of on-the-job training, but in time he emerged as the ace in 1959. By then he'd mastered the curveball. He could always throw it, but he managed to locate it better, became a premier pitch. And many of the people I interviewed for the book and have interviewed elsewhere say Camilo and Sandy Koufax were the two premier curveballers of their day. Camilo rode that pitch to win 20 games in both 1962 and 1963. I had a long talk with Camilo about Tony's early days. It didn't take long. He started fast. Tony had an 8-game hitting streak, was batting near 400 for most of the first month. And suddenly he was the victim of a lot of high heat. He was being knocked on his butt a lot by pitchers, few possible beatings. He got close. He was constantly hitting the dirt. And Camilo said one of the scariest beatings he ever saw involved Tony, and it was on May 22nd of '64. At the time, we were several weeks into the season. Tony was still hitting .392 at that point. He'd gotten a single off Orioles pitcher Steve Barber in the first inning, and the next time he came up, Barber beamed him on the first pitch with a fastball. And Camilo says it was the scariest beating he'd ever seen because Tony did not dip out, and it literally hit him in the middle of the forehead, hit him so hard it cracked the batting helmet and knocked out some of the TC on their helmet. And Camilo says, you know, not only was it one of the scariest, but he had just never seen anything like it. Players tended to tip their head and dive out, but he said that Tony was just someone who would not back down. You know, he would get up after being hit or after being knocked on his butt, and would get up and was just as determined as ever. He offered to take Tony to the hospital for observation. They wanted to have him checked out. And so Camilo offered to drive him, took him over to the hospital. And once he realized his friend wasn't seriously hurt, he said he couldn't help tease him. He said, "You really watched that pitch, didn't you, Tony?" I guess he did. Well, Camilo, his wife Rachel, and children were well settled in the U.S. by the time the Bay of Pigs invasion took place. And at that point, his family was primarily anchored in Spain. Tony did have his parents and one sister still in Cuba, and they were left behind. So Griffith again helped work channels. Then U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey stepped in, also helped out, and Camilo and his family were reunited in 1964, roughly 3 years after Cuba closed. Well, this is Zoilo Versailles. To me, is one of the most intriguing twins, Cuban or otherwise. Here's a man who grew up dirt poor in a small shack in Havana, and yet he turned out to be an extremely creative cook. He just entranced family, friends, twins, teammates with his cooking. And his daughter Ampy, his oldest daughter, had told me that he could take things he would never think of cooking together, and he'd throw them together and make up a wonderful dish. And what also was intriguing about this man who grew up poor is he had a love for opera, and he could sing the genre. And it wasn't uncommon for Twins players to hear his powerful voice emanating from the shower in the clubhouse after a game. Just a very, very fascinating man. Zoilo also battled severe anxiety issues. He was a 21-year-old rookie with the Twins in '61, when Cuba closed. His wife Maria was back in Cuba, pregnant with Ampy, the oldest daughter. They had 6 daughters together, and she was caught at home. The process of getting his visa, or getting her visa, hit bureaucratic snags, frustrating Zoilo to a point where after a July 4th doubleheader, Zoilo emptied out his locker. He was going home. Just decided he'd had enough. And, well, he didn't go home, it turns out, but he suffered an ulcer during that 3-week absence from the Twins. Another sign how he paid severely for when he suffered. but within a year, him and Maria were reunited. Zoilo, of course, was considered one of the best defensive shortstops of the era, just a remarkable fielder, but he also then emerged to win the 1965 MVP award when the Twins went to the World Series. Interestingly, he's often been cited as one of the weaker winners, but he did also lead the league in runs, doubles, triples, and total bases. And he seemed to figure in so many Twins late rallies that year. You look at the records, and he would get the leadoff hit late in the inning to start a rally that won a game, or he got a key hit, or he drove in the winning run. And particularly when the Twins were doing late inning comebacks, which were plentiful that year, Zoilo always seemed to be in the thick of it. It's really hard to fathom the Twins winning the 1965 pennant without Zoilo. And it's also hard to imagine them winning it without Tony, who emerged as an MVP candidate during the second half. At one point late in the season, Tony was heard saying, "Let Zoilo have the MVP, I'll take the batting title and the pennant." And that came to pass. And this is our last featured Cuban. This is Sandy Valdespino in the locker room with Tony. Valdespino grew up on the outskirts of Havana and grew up quickly. His father passed away when he was 9, and from that point on, he quickly took a job with a pipe factory in his town. He says he spent most of his days divided between 3 pursuits. He went to school in the morning, he worked in the afternoon, and then when he could, he played baseball in the evening. Sandy spent a number of years in the minors before surfacing with the Twins during their 1965 season when they won the pennant. He was loved by teammates. This was a guy that always smiled, great sunny disposition, and kept things very loose in the clubhouse. He stood just 5'6". I think the records always show him as 5'8", but in fact he was 5'6", and once in 1963, playing for AAA Atlanta, he had been mistaken for the team's bat boy. But it turns out Sandy did have quite broad shoulders for a man his size, and he really did demonstrate quite a bit of pop with his bat. In fact, the Twins, of course, in the '65 series ran up against the pitching-rich Dodgers. Didn't fare very well. They'd only been shut out 3 times during the regular season, but they were shut out 3 times by the Dodgers. But interestingly, Sandy managed to collect hits off both Koufax and Don Drysdale, the 2 aces of the Dodgers staff. Now, Sandy believed going to the U.S. to play baseball was an opportunity to provide for his widowed mother, but suddenly she died during his first year in the United States. He still has relatives in Cuba. He sends money and medicines to them from time to time, but he's never returned in the nearly 55 years since Cuba has closed. Well, let's get to Tony. And here he is after he won the 1965 batting title, which is a remarkable feat as well. Not only was he the first rookie to win the batting title in the American League in '64, when he repeated in '65, he became the first and only player to win batting titles in his first 2 seasons. While Tony was roughing up American League pitchers in those 2 seasons, reporters would frequently ask him about his approach at the plate, and Tony in his simple English would say, "I see the ball, I hit the ball." And I think maybe some of you have heard that about Tony. Much also is made of the fact that he rarely knew a pitcher's name. On opening day, he went 2 for 4. This is in his rookie year. He went 2 for 4, collected 2 hits off Cleveland's Mudcat Grant. And after the game, Vic Power in the clubhouse was talking about Mudcat. And Tony responded, "Oh, that's a funny name. Who is this Mudcat?" And Power was just flabbergasted. You know, how could he come out, get 2 hits, and he doesn't know who he faced? And when he did explain it to Tony, Tony responded, "Well, what is a Mudcat?" And that's been a question left unanswered. But teammates did find it humorous that Tony didn't know the names of pitchers, and many assumed he was just seeing the ball and hitting the ball. But Tony says the perception was much more of a language issue. Names were hard for him to remember in the early days in the United States, and he couldn't verbalize what he was doing more often than not. But he said he was memorizing everything that everybody threw to him the very first time he faced them. And by the time he faced them a second time, he had it up here, what he was going to see from them. And undoubtedly that's a skill that worked for him very well. I thought I'd share one more Vic Power story at this point, which really demonstrated Tony's fanatical work ethic, which is something that clearly came from working on a family farm that was not mechanized. The story goes that Power, a great practical joker and a character in his own right, told Tony early in his career that Ted Williams credited snow shoveling for his upper body strength and his success at the plate. Well, Tony, being single and living in a hotel, obviously wasn't shoveling snow, but the story goes is that Power had Tony shoveling his sidewalk for a stretch. happening that Tony would neither confirm nor deny when I talked to him about it. But oh, here we go. Now this is something many of us know about Tony. Here he is launching a bat, and it was something that wasn't uncommon, especially early in his career. Tony tended to hold the bat very loosely. He didn't like to use the stickum that players would use. But what many people don't know is that he suffered a knuckle injury on his right middle hand very early in his rookie season, and he won the 2 batting titles with this injury. He was facing Dick Raddatz, the Boston hard-throwing closer, in May of '64, just several weeks into a season. He took a swing, lost the grip of his bat, and the end handle struck his middle finger on his right hand. And the finger immediately swelled to twice its size, and it remained swollen for nearly the entire season. But he just kept hitting. And one reason Tony discovered that if he made contact and hit the ball, it wasn't painful. But if he swung and missed, it was very painful. Talk about an incentive to win a batting title. And sure enough. But what he did find is that if he swung and missed, that's when he commonly would launch a bat. Harmon Killebrew once told me that he was hit twice in the on-deck circle by Tony. Now the swelling subsided during the off-season, but it became a problem immediately early in spring training the next, in Florida the next year. It was at that time a bone chip finally surfaced on an x-ray. Nothing had ever shown up, and at that point surgery would have been the answer. Tony decided he wasn't going to do surgery during the season, didn't want to miss any time, and so he bypassed it. Well, it turns out he started out very slowly in 1965. Near the midpoint of the season, he was trailing the batting leader, Carl Yastrzemski, by more than 70 points in the batting race. But he had a second half for the ages, and he won that second batting title. Tony was an atypical hitter in many ways. He could turn on pitches with the best of them, but he was just as likely to let the ball come deep into the hitting zone and then drive it the opposite way. This was something he did expertly, and more than one person I interviewed for this book said that Tony, a left-handed hitter with very powerful wrists, could drive the ball to left field as hard or harder than any right-handed hitter they had seen. And also, much like Yogi Berra, Tony was known as a bad ball hitter. He might hack at a pitch in his eyes, he might hit a tee shot a couple inches off the ground and drive it deep into the outfield. In fact, 2 Twins pitchers of the era, Hall of Famer Bert Blyleven and Bill Campbell, recalled Tony hitting a home run on a ball that bounced in the dirt before he hit it. And of course, technically this would be illegal. That's not within the realm of play, but if the umpire missed the call, maybe it happened. One of the 2 pitchers thought it was hit off White Sox knuckleballer Wilbur Wood. Well, it turns out I did manage to interview Wood for the book, and neither Wood nor my own research verified this particular home run ever happened. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't be shocked if it had. So, Tony's ability to put wood on the ball generated long hitting streaks, and there were long stretches where it just seemed nearly impossible to get him out. He had multiple hitting streaks of 10 or more games those first 2 years. He just would chain long hits. He had a 17-game streak at one point, and then I think he went hitless in one game and then hit 14 more straight. And so he's hitting 30, 32 out of, just a remarkable stretch of hitting. There was a series with Baltimore during the 1965 pennant race against the Orioles, in which Oliva went 15 for 21 with 3 walks. Now this was against a very good pitching staff in Baltimore, and at one point during that series he accumulated 9 straight hits. It was a Twins record, and his production has not been forgotten. Harmon Killebrew told me in a 2009 interview that whenever the Hall of Famers would gather here in Cooperstown, it wasn't uncommon for both Jim Palmer and Brooks Robinson to talk about that series and what Tony did. Just absolutely floored about his production. Interestingly, Brooks also said that he always thought Tony Oliva was the toughest out for the Orioles. And we're talking about a pitching staff that was very strong through the 60s and early 70s. And I did look it up. Sure enough, in 157 career games against the Orioles, roughly the equivalent of a full season, Oliva hit 331, slugged 490, powered 18 homers, and drove in 86 runs. Well, interestingly, for all his hitting prowess, probably what Oliva is as proud of as anything is winning the Gold Glove in 1966. This comes 5 years after he'd arrived. He barely could catch a fly ball. A Twins coach, a gentleman named Del Wilbur, for a couple instructional league seasons, basically just spent the whole time hitting Oliva fly balls. And Jim Cott was in camp for one of those instructional league sessions. He was working on a new pitch, and he said he would watch it, and it was just remarkable how few balls Oliva even got a glove on at that point in time. I also talked to Lee Stang about it, and he said, well, Tony could hit, but he couldn't catch a cold. And, well, Tony, of course, in those first 8 years, did basically assemble what was close to a Hall of Fame career. In June of 1971, he suffered a devastating knee injury diving for a ball in Oakland. In those 8 healthy seasons, he won 3 batting titles, led all major leaguers in doubles, and ranked 3rd in total bases behind only Billy Williams and Hank Aaron. Also in those 8 years, only Pete Rose, Roberto Clemente, and Lou Brock averaged more hits per game. Well, Tony did endure 2 knee surgeries within a year's time after the injury in 1971. When he returned in 1973, he was essentially playing on one healthy leg. The one knee and the second surgery, they pulled out roughly 100 pieces of cartilage out of the knee. There wasn't a whole lot left. Well, sadly by then as well, Harmon Killebrew had been dealing with was basically a severely damaged knee from an old football injury. And that's the year, of course, 1973, when the American League owners voted to use the designated hitter. Normally, Calvin Griffith would have opposed this, knowing that might be adding another substantial salary to his lineup. But because he had basically 2 designated hitters on his roster, he voted for it, and of course the DH passed. Well, Tony at this point still hit for average. He didn't have another 300 season, but we're talking a time when the average across the entire American League tended to run in the 240s, 250s. The big thing is that his power was gone. He just never was able to turn on pitches like he could. Pitchers could work him inside, and he just couldn't really fight it off. Well, Tony's career came to a premature end in 1976, and he went on to quite a distinguished coaching career. He was the hitting coach in 1987 when the Twins won their first World Series, and he was the co-hitting coach in 91 when the Twins won again. His coaching tendencies began as a player. He always was so thankful for the people that helped him out early in his career. He cites Earl Batty and even some of the pitchers, Jim Cobb, who helped him out with language issues, and many of the Twins that really stepped up for him. And in 1967, when Rod Carew arrived on the scene, Tony was his roommate, his road roommate, and they roomed together for an entire decade until Oliva retired after the '76 season. Carew admits that he was a moody, antisocial kid at the time, and he didn't really enjoy a lot of the peripherals that came with being a major leaguer. But Tony drew him into clubhouse card games with Earl Batty and Sandy Valdespino and others. And when they were on the road, they talked incessantly. They went out to eat. They'd always be talking about the pitchers they faced and about hitting. And Carew gives him a remarkable amount of credit for getting started and for his early success. Tony also helped many others. Come to mind would be Lyman Bostock, who was a Twin star in the mid-70s, and also Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett. Kirby was a very similar hitter as Tony, sprayed the ball all over, made hard contact, hit for batting average, but he only hit 4 home runs in his first 2 seasons. And both Tony and the Twins management thought, with Puckett's thick build, that he really should be hitting with more power. Kirby initially resisted, thought it would have compromised his batting average, and but in the spring of 1986, he agreed to start working with Tony, and Tony decided what he would probably benefit from would be a high leg kick to help generate power to swing through. And of course, if you know Kirby Puckett, that became his trademark, that high leg kick. Timing was the issue, in the beginning. Timing with the pitcher took some time. By the end of spring training, he kind of liked it, decided he was going to go with it. And sure enough, in 1986, he hit a career high 31 homers, drove in 96 runs, generally hit 15 to 30 homers the rest of his career. That was also his first 300 season. It didn't really hurt him at all to pull the ball a little more. And for 8 of the next 10 seasons, Puckett did hit 300. Carew also told me about those tough times Tony endured after his knee was compromised. They were on the road. Carew would wake up and hear Tony crying and realize that he was actually crying in his sleep from the knee pain. Sometimes he might wake up and there would be Tony sitting on the edge of the bed with an ice pack on his knee, hoping to nail the pain enough to go back to sleep. Tony would try every home remedy to work on those knees early in the injury time. Once Carew came into the Twins clubhouse to find Tony spraying STP, the engine treatment on his knee. Someone had told him it might work. And when Tony told him that, Carew could only say, "Tony, you're not a car." And it was one of those things. Tony was willing to try anything. The knee problems unfortunately sabotaged his career, But so many good things happened to him in the 1970s. In November of 70, a few months short of a decade after he left Cuba to come to the United States, he reunited with his mother Anita and sister Felicia in Mexico, where he was playing winter ball. It was the first chance for his mother to meet his children. He had 2 of 3 children at that point. They were toddlers, but Gordette and Anita had a wonderful time in Mexico. A year later, Felicia returned, and this time she brought Pedro, Tony's father, who goes by Perico. They had a wonderful time in Mexico. At that point, Tony wasn't playing because of a knee injury, so he got to spend a lot of time with his father and his sister. When it came time to return to Minnesota, Felicia and Perico extended their visas and traveled to Minnesota with him. Perico and Felicia had never seen snow, of course, and at one point Tony took his father ice fishing. And at one point they were driving on the lake to set up to fish, and Perico asked where the lake was. And then Perico was equally surprised to see the first fish come out of the hole in the ice. They did go travel to spring training together, and at that point Perico finally did get to see his son play Major League Baseball. Well, Tony himself returned to Cuba for the first time after the 1972 season, more than 11 years after leaving home. He could only get a visa for himself at that time, so he traveled on his own. But he was elated to see his parents again, and he says he walked on air for the entire trip. He also got to see his siblings. The youngest siblings were still children when he left, and now they were adults, and he had a whole host of nieces and nephews that he had never seen before. Over the years, traveling to Cuba for Cuban natives and their families has become much easier. He now goes nearly every year, and by the late 1980s, he could bring family. And I think for Tony, this might be his greatest joy in life. Now he's at a point in life where his family, Gordette and the children, all know the family that was left behind in Cuba. Thank you. Glad to have you stick with me.
We have time for a couple of questions before we head out into the atrium, where Thom will be signing copies of his book. Yes, Jeff?
What encouraged you to write about Tony Oliva in particular? Why did you pick him?
Primarily because I was a fan. I grew up in St. Paul. I lived there since '78, but I was a big fan. I was just fascinated with this guy that could hit any pitch, just spray it anywhere, and that wide stance. And always just fascinated with him as a hitter. I thought he was one of the more fun players to watch. And then what really sold me on it is then I pitched it to him. I met him for lunch one day, and when he told me about the whole notion that he was going to go back to Cuba unsigned, and the fact that the return visa took so long gave him a second chance, that was the selling point. I thought, that's just a remarkable twist of fate that happened to a man that, like I say, what if it hadn't happened? There wouldn't have been a career and I wouldn't be standing here today. So.
Follow-up, Jeff?
Has he expressed anything with regards to the Hall of Fame and not gaining entry into the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, I think he gets a little frustrated. He certainly believes he belongs in. I'm one of those two people too, but yeah, I think he'd like to go in. I don't think there's any doubt. The whole issue is the shortened career, and there's another twist to it too that I discovered while doing the research. Is it a valid point? I think it is. It may not be. A lot of Hall of Famers have been admitted based on having shortened careers because of events outside their control. The Negro Leaguers stand out in that regard. Many of them were talented enough to make it anyway, but they had a short career based on the fact that they just were not allowed in the game. And Tony was kind of a victim of where he grew up in Cuba. Papa Joe Cambry really only scouted a van in the suburbs nearby, and it's just a stroke of luck that he was discovered. There was a Twins minor leaguer, Roberto Fernandez, who had a brief minor league career here, went back, and Tony played on a town team with them, and they were the number 3-4 hitters. Fernandez at that point I think might have been in his 40s. Tony was in his teens, early 20s, and that's how he became known to Papa Joe Cambria. But by the time he came over, he was 23 years old. That's at a time when pure hitters like Tony were already in the majors. Most of the Hall of Famers from that era were in the majors at age 21 or 22. And it only took him 3 years to make it, but he lost 3 to 5 years. Some people say, oh, he never had 2,000 hits. That might have helped bridge the gap. Well, if he might have come over 2-3 years later, he probably would have had that. And a lot of the other numbers would have been bolstered as well. So he really, by misfortune on one end and an injury on the other, he lost time on both ends of his career.
Andrew?
terms of the racism that he faced, and him and the other Hispanic players in time, like Roberto Clemente, how intense would you say that was? Was it like on the level of a Jackie Robinson, where they're getting death threats, or that, or what was the atmosphere in that like?
I think a lot of the Latin players certainly did experience racism, the shouts from the crowds, that sort of thing, and it was kind of shocking to a lot of them because they came from somewhere where they were coming to this democracy, and they were very shocked at it. But once he married, he said it just wasn't really much of an issue. I hope I'm answering your question. I might have missed something. If I haven't, please let me know. But he did particularly find once he married Gordette, there really were no issues. I suppose his celebrity maybe helped a little bit, but they themselves determined that racism was the other people's problem, the people who might reach out or strike out against them, and they refused to really acknowledge it. And for the most part, Tony never addressed racism as a big issue. He got stuck on a bus one time when his minor league team went into a restaurant and they wouldn't serve him. He was so mad he went off to the bus and refused to. They said he could eat in the kitchen, and he refused to do that. So, did I answer your question? I missed a little in the beginning. Oh, okay.
Tom, were the Twin Cities of the 60s, was it racially tolerant in general?
I certainly think more so than a lot of places. It's what I knew, of course, and there were certainly some race riots in Minneapolis, and there were some police racial related issues. And, the campuses were very active in the civil rights movement, but it did seem extremely tolerant to me. And Vic Power used to talk about how accepting everybody was. He said he would just consistently get invited into people's homes for meals. And Power was Puerto Rican, but and really there was very little racism in Puerto Rico, and it was quite a shock. In fact, he tells a story. He went into a restaurant one time, and the person at the counter said, I can't serve you. And he says, well, I don't want black people, I want rice and beans. He kind of turned the idea of serving you and flipped it around, and that was the kind of guy he was. But yeah, most of the players will talk about how racially tolerant things were. So.
Take one more question.
Did he ever express any views on his thoughts on Fidel Castro and what ultimately was the Communist Revolution?
No, I made a commitment with him. He is apolitical, stridently so. And I made a commitment with him that I would not make it a political book in any sense of the word. I gave some very basic facts about Cuba, even a few basic facts about what triggered the revolution, but I really stayed clear of that, and he has made no mention of it. I don't personally have a clue how he feels about Castro or any of it. To him, it was always about baseball and family. He only went back for family. He goes back, he doesn't do touristy things. He doesn't go stay in Havana for a week. He goes back to that small little hamlet where his family is, and they spend their entire time there. So, yeah, he's very committed to being apolitical. And when the announcement came over about diplomatic relations a year or so ago, that he said what I would have expected. He said, it's great for Cuban families who want to go back, and it's great because we'll have more baseball players here. And that's basically what he said about it.
Well, our thanks to Tom. We're going to head out into the atrium now. The book is available for purchase in our bookstore, and Tom would be more than happy to sign and personalize any copies for you. I'm actually holding a paperback which is called the Advanced Reading Copy that the publisher sent to me, but the book that you would be getting here is a much nicer hardcover. So just want to let you know about that. Thanks, Tom. Let's have a nice round of applause.